Okay, wonderful. Hello and welcome and good evening. I hope everyone is doing well today. For those of you who I haven't had the opportunity to meet, my name is Erica Jenkins and I'm the manager of annual giving and alumni relations at the School of Education. And on behalf of the SOE, it's my honor to welcome you to the first event in our Centennial Conversation series. Before we kick things off, I just have a few housekeeping items, Zoom items, I like to say. First, for the best Zoom experience, please toggle to speaker view, which is located in the upper right-hand side of your screen. We found that this is the best Zoom format for this type of event so that the speaker is front and center rather than seeing several little boxes. And secondly, we currently have attendees muted. But once we get into the Q&A portion of the event and we really get the conversation going, please just make sure that you are muted if you're not speaking. And with that, it is my pleasure to hand the Zoom over to our Dean, Elizabeth Burr-Moji.
Well, good evening, everyone. It's so wonderful to have so many people joining us tonight in our first event of the School of Education Centennial Conversation series. And we really do hope this will be a conversation. We have set it up so that we are feeding questions to our esteemed panelists, but we do want to invite you to converse with us. That's the whole point of this event. I'm thrilled that so many of you are here, and we have 150 people who have responded to our invitation. So I'm sure that the numbers will continue to grow as we go through the evening. And we really want to focus on critical topics that are going to help inform our next 100 years. The Centennial is a unique opportunity for our School of Education to reflect on the history of the school, to celebrate the ways we've served as leaders and innovators, but also the ways that we've served to shape the public good locally, nationally, and globally. And we have here with us tonight scholars who have done all of those things. We also take care to apply a critical lens to ourselves and to our legacy. We want to consider the ways we've advanced excellent, just, and equitable education, while acknowledging moments in which we missed opportunities to do so, or actually even contributed to education problems and to larger societal problems. In the coming months, we look forward to providing opportunities to learn from School of Education scholars and opportunities for us to bring together our collective expertise as we envision the future of our school and the future of education in the coming century. Now, this evening, we will hear from faculty from the Center for the Study of Higher and Post-Secondary Education. The center, founded in 1960, is ranked as the #1 higher education program in the United States, in the world, really, by US News and World Report. You probably all know that already because we talk about it a lot. And a primary reason for that honor is their outstanding faculty, several of whom I am proud to welcome to our virtual stage. And I'll ask them to wave a hand as I say their names. Now, for the sake of brevity, we sent the panelists full biographies to you in advance. So we hope that you had a chance to read them. But I'd like to ask you to join me in welcoming Professors Michael Bastido. Michael's going to give you a wave. Sue Donarski, Rosemary Perez, and Awilda Rodriguez. Thank you for being here with us, our esteemed and wonderful colleagues, to discuss the topic, can you get here from there? What factors help ensure access to higher education for those who seek it? That's really what we want to try to mine, to try to really drill down into with these fabulous scholars. And so we're going to start with questions that we have crafted, and then we're going to actually take questions that came into us from our respondents, our group here, our audience, and then we will open it up for a more live Q&A. So I'm going to direct questions to people and then others can jump in as well. But I'm going to start with a question for each of you. What has been the focus of your research in regard to the issue of college access? And what improvements have you observed since you began studying this issue? And I'm going to do this in the most democratic way I know, and that is alphabetical order. And then maybe we'll reverse the alphabetical order for the next question so we can be as democratic as possible. And so that means, Mike Bastido, you're up.
Okay, thanks. Hi, everyone. It's great to see so many people that I know, actually, people, students and alumni and friends of the center. So thank you so much for coming today. So my research, it's a dangerous question, Elizabeth, to ask faculty to talk about their research and keep it to a few minutes. I'll say that as I passed my tenure decision, one of the things I had been tenured on was work I'd done on stratification, about how inequality is affecting students, particularly among different kinds of institutions where students enroll. And as an organizations person, I was very interested in sort of like the organizational mechanisms by which that would happen. And it seemed to me that admissions was a great place to look at that because admissions is really where the rubber hits the road in terms of entering college, right? Like you have to make decisions. It's a zero-sum game. You have to decide what your values are going to be in that decision-making process. And as someone who is really interested in how organizations make decisions, to me, that's sort of a fascinating arena. But I didn't have a ton of experience at the time. So I actually spent my first sabbatical doing field work in university admissions offices, and two of them in different parts of the country, to really understand more deeply how decisions were being made and how those would intersect with questions of stratification and inequality. And so I learned a lot. And so I was sort of sensitized to these particular theories around decision-making, and I started writing up what I was finding. And then, I knew though that, what I was writing up couldn't prove any, I had insights, but I really wanted to prove to people that I thought that some certain kinds of decision-making biases were happening inside of admissions offices. And so with a colleague of mine, Nick Bowman, who is also an alum, and I don't know if he's here today, we designed an experiment to try to see if we could find if decision-making biases occurred in admissions practices. And just to keep it real short, we did find that. We actually found a pretty large effect, about a 25% effect when we changed the way certain kinds of information was provided to admissions officers. And that gave us some insight into not just, to some specific things that could be done, particularly around contextualizing admissions practices, and I could talk more about that later. But also that these decisions were just malleable. Admissions officers were experts, but that didn't mean that their decision-making was unchangeable. And actually one of the results of our study was that it didn't matter if someone had worked in an admissions office for 1 year or 15 years or 30 years, whether they were the director of admission or they were a brand new person in the office. All of them were affected by certain decision-making biases that we could actually understand and then try to intersect. And so then after that, my work has gone into trying to ameliorate this problem. So working on creating an instrument that's called Landscape that helps to give admissions officers new and more robust information in the admissions process so that they can contextualize the data that they're provided through applications. The data from applications is mostly individual level by nature. Admissions officers were always interested in, to some extent, in having more contextual data, but that data was not very good. So really good data about individuals, really bad data about contexts. And so I've been working to try to provide better data on contexts. And so far the results are good. We have a paper right now that's under review that shows that the initial set of schools that adopted Landscape are admitting more low-income students and students with higher, we'll call it adversity indexes than they were before. So hopefully this is moving in a positive direction.
That's awesome, Mike. And I love the way you really took the research to an intervention. So that's really powerful. Let's turn it over to Sue and hear from Sue about the changes that have occurred and what specific things you've done to make those changes.
Thanks very much, everyone, for having me here. And I hope that we do not get interrupted by two very enthusiastic large dogs, but it may well happen. So just, it's not my kids, it's my dogs. So I focus on inequality. I'm trained as an economist. and I focus on inequality in educational attainment, in educational achievement, and then how that affects people's lives later on. So in particular, I focused on income inequality and the role of parental education in inequality that we see in college access, as well as in college completion. So, we've had a big spike in college attendance over recent decades. And where so that's been progress, where a lot of the inequality has been intensifying is in completion, because whether you finish college tends to be a real function of what college you go to and what resources you have. And so we've got dropout rates that are twice as high, say, for the lowest income students as they are for the upper income students. And that can feed into lots of problems, like, say, you've got student debt, but you don't have a degree to help pay it off, right? So it creates a lot of issues. So the aspects of the financial aid system that I focus on the financial aid system, as well as on the application and admissions process more recently. So student loans and how to decide the financial aid system in a way so that it actually helps get more people to college rather than intensify inequality. One thing that I discovered, one thing I learned very early on in my research was that complicated bureaucracies intensify inequality, because having the know-how and the resources to maneuver through those bureaucracies tends to correlate with whether your parents went to college. There's nothing by learning by doing, and if they've got the money to help you through the process. So even just to think about something as simple as registering for the SAT, right? So in Michigan, we're fortunate in that the SAT is taken in school on a school day for free. It's required. It's part of schooling. In most states, that's not the case. And if you live in a city and your parents don't have a car, and the SAT is being given in a suburb on a Saturday where the buses don't run on Saturdays because they're for commuters, and you don't have a credit card to it's sort of the complications of it pile up if you sort of think about it through the eyes of the student. And in all of this, I think one of my advantages is that I'm a first generation college graduate myself, and can put myself in the feet, in the shoes of these students. And I think that's an important perspective for thinking about how to design policies and how to understand what the barriers are. Because if you've never faced a barrier, you don't tend to get it. In that, I do a lot of explaining in a lot of rooms with policymakers and with academics as well about what the real barriers are. So, I'll be giving a talk at MIT, and an economist will say, the FAFSA is not very complicated. I filled it out last night. Well, Mr. PhD economist at MIT, you're actually not the target that I'm thinking about. I say it sometimes more politely than that. So policies I've worked on at the federal level, working to simplify the student aid system, the FAFSA, some of which has been implemented, especially the last round of legislation that came through the Senate Help Committee, eliminated a whole bunch of questions from the FAFSA to try to simplify the process a bit. I've helped to establish the Hale Scholarship and the Go Blue Guarantee here at University of Michigan, and with a randomized trial evaluated the effect of the Hale Scholarship by giving low-income students a commitment of their financial aid early in the process instead of waiting until they apply and get admitted. We were able to, among low-income students in Michigan, nearly triple the application rate and increase by over 100 the number of low-income students who were entering the university each fall. And so that's probably the thing I've been proudest of. COVID is making all inequality worse. So any margin of inequality that you can think of, dimension of inequality, COVID is making it worse. It's making it harder for kids to finish high school. It's making it harder for them to go through the college application process. And what we're seeing right now is that there's been a substantial drop in in attendance for undergraduates, and it's concentrated in community colleges and among disadvantaged students. Harvard and Michigan is doing just fine. We've got enrollment. Graduate schools are doing just fine. But the people that I worry about and study the most are the ones who are having the biggest challenges. And I'm afraid that we may be undoing years of progress. On that happy note, I will stop talking.
Yes, that's a good point to stop, Sue. And I just want to underscore the importance of the Hale Scholarship and the Go Blue Guarantee and how it's led the nation. Now we have, Gamecock guarantees and woodchuck guarantees, and all campuses across the country are trying to do something similar. So really a great point of leadership. Let's turn it to Rosie now and hear your response to this same question.
Yeah, good evening, everybody. Again, my name is Rosie Perez. I use she, her pronouns, and it's an honor to be here as a faculty member in the center and also as an alum of the center. It's a special space to be in with you tonight. So my research broadly focuses on college student learning and development and is really an extension of my work as a student affairs educator. So a lot of my work has been, I started my career working with first-year college students. So once they get there, how do we get them to stay? And then how do we get them through college? For the past 5 years, I have been a member of the Promoting at Promise Student Success, or PASS project, which was led by Dr. Adriana Kizar, another CSHPE alum. And she's also the director of the Pullias Center at USC. The PASS project, we studied a foundation-funded comprehensive college transition program that supports low-income students in the state of Nebraska. So this program is really unique. Students get up to 5 years of tuition scholarship. And then if they choose to attend a University of Nebraska system school, so Lincoln, Omaha, or Kearney, they participate in a comprehensive transition program, which is 2 years long, and the students take small classes with other scholarship recipients. They get peer mentoring, proactive advising, major in career support and development, and they have lots of academic and social programs. So I worked on the campus at Omaha and spent a lot of time building relationships with students, faculty, and staff there. And what I learned is, financial support is the base, right? It's to Sue's point, right? That helps get people in the door, but what's going to keep them? And there has to be intentional support to retain low-income students once they enroll. And in particular, this program really focuses on validating students, both academically and interpersonally, in context across the program. So in every space, students are getting the message that the assets they bring with them as low-income folks from varying backgrounds in terms of race, ethnicity, linguistic ability, folks who might be immigrants, folks that are coming from farms, rural communities, right? Folks who typically aren't centered in higher ed. These students consistently get the message that they belong there and that they have the capacity to succeed. They can do college work and that they can achieve their goals. And so that intentionality of creating a validating environment across the program and really building it into the culture of these programs has been vital to supporting student success. So the retention rate first to second year is often like close to 90% of retaining these students. And at the campus I work at, the first year retention rate is on average across all students is closer to 60. So students are typically graduating at higher rates in this program. They retain longer. They don't all finish, but a higher rate for sure. This program, being that it's served many students well, and what we're working with this program now is to really think about how we share the lessons learned across the campus, right? Because students don't live in a vacuum. They don't only take classes in this program. They don't interact with people only in this program. So how do we take the good practices that are there and share them across the campus? How do you build a campus culture that is really designed to support low-income student success? And I think that's like a really pivotal question. In addition to thinking of those programs as incubators, really thinking about how do we share these lessons with other campuses? So that is actually the next phase of this project, is really trying to amplify the good work that they have been doing in the Thompson Scholars Program.
It's wonderful, Rosie. And again, you know, like Mike and Sue, you're really putting your research into action in such powerful ways. And that's why we recruited you to come here. And we're so glad to have you as our colleague. So Awilda, what would you say about your research and the different kinds of improvements that you've observed since you started doing this work?
Good evening, everyone. I'm Awilda Rodriguez. I guess I think I work at the other end of the spectrum from Rosie. I came with this work from working in college access programs before I embarked on my PhD. So I thought a lot about how students needed to be positioned, particularly underrepresented students at selective institutions, how to best position them for selective admissions. I started off thinking a lot about admissions, but then quickly realized in my research in the last few years has really been a focus around academic preparation and equitable access to academic preparation, particular whether and how Black, Latinx, Native American, low-income students, first-gen students do or don't have access to college prep courses. And how are these opportunities structured across and within high schools? How do school personnel make these decisions and ration out these opportunities? What are the implications for college admission? So these are some of the questions that my research team and I have been working on these past few years. And one area I think of improvement that we've seen is that, and I think really surprised me in the data, is that college prep classes like advanced placement, more so advanced placement than international baccalaureate, but they're more available now than ever before. And particularly at low resource high schools. And that is in large part due to a lot of federal and state policies that have really provided, in the 90s and the 2000s, support for these programs to operate and to be launched at these lower resource schools. So the data will tell you now that the probability of white students and Black students having exposure to at least one AP course or these gateway courses like Algebra 2, these probabilities are pretty close to equal. And that wasn't always the case. So all types of high schools, not just the affluent ones, offer advanced courses now, which again, pretty much surprised me in the data. But there's a part 2 to your question, so I can answer the flip side of that as well.
All right. Well, good. I'm going to keep you on the dais here, and we're going to go in reverse alphabetical order. And I'm going to ask you to talk about, you've talked about the improvements. So, what are the barriers that still exist to access? What's being done, and and what's your role in that work?
Yeah, and that's kind of where my research is living right now. And so, given what I said about course offerings, there are still challenges in actually accessing these courses and getting and graduating with these courses on your transcript, right? And the problem is twofold, right? So you have, if you're a white student or higher income student, you're more likely to go to a high school that is going to offer a breadth of advanced placement courses or rigorous courses. That's going to make you more competitive for admission, right? My research team and I have visited high schools where they offer over 20 AP courses with multiple sections for popular courses. They have a deep bench of teachers that are certified to teach all sorts of advanced placement courses, right? But students from historically marginalized communities are more likely to go to high schools that offer fewer advanced course opportunities. And so, these are structural issues with really deep historical roots and disparate educational funding, right? The second challenge is that just because your school offers one or several of these rigorous courses, it doesn't mean that students who have traditionally been marginalized from these classes actually get access to them. So some school personnel have set up policies and practices that emulate tracking and put up barriers for students, similar to what Sue was talking about, sort of like these bureaucracies that complicate. And what we found also was that generally a lot of the schools underestimate the racial gaps in participation. And we've been able to ask people qualitatively and sort of compare that with actual data. And so, if it's not identified as a problem at the school and at the ground level, then how will people actually even work to resolve these issues? And so, that's sort of a next step for us, is trying to put together an intervention to be able to see if we can shape the beliefs of the adults in the school to see if it can improve on the actual composition of students in advanced courses. And so while there have been these strides in closing the gaps in these course offerings, the racial gaps, the data shows us that the racial gaps in course taking has actually widened. So there's a lot of work to be done in this area. And we'll be trying to tackle a little corner of it.
Yeah, Awilda, your work really shows us that, we can make movement forward, but we have to look really carefully at, what are the implications of the changes that are made, because it can be easy, right, for policymakers to say, oh, we did that, but they don't see the sort of hidden variables that really create these barriers. So I'm wondering, we'll go in reverse order, and I'll ask Rosie, what are the barriers that you still want to tackle? What do you want to take on?
I'm really taken by the idea that we have to have campus cultures, full campus environments that are committed to serving low-income students. I love these programs. I have learned so much working alongside the educators that I've worked with in the Thompson Scholars Program. And the reality is lots of campuses have these small spaces where students feel that they matter and they feel supported. You might see that in a TRIO program, right? The reality is, the students should feel that way when they're outside of that office. And that is not the case for many low-income students, right? In other spaces, everything else tells them they don't belong. They can't afford the MacBook. I've had students talk to me in other settings about Canada Goose jackets. I had no idea what that was. Until I looked it up on Google and saw the price tag and almost passed out. But that was such a norm in some institutions, including Michigan, that all students had these $1,000 jackets. And the reality is we don't really talk about class and classism. We may talk about income, but we don't talk about class and classism and how that shapes and constrains how students experience the institution, how that shapes curriculum, what is good writing or beautiful writing, what kind of policies we create, what kind of practices we have that we assume folks can just figure things out. And so, I'd argue that we need to really, let's talk about class. Let's really talk about how we have built classism into the institution if we want to actually design policy and practice that is here to support low-income students, because by and large, the messages they get is you're lucky to be here. Now you need to assimilate and follow the new rules, right? And that deficit perspective, ultimately tells folks that if you are low-income, working class, or poor, you're just lucky to be here. And really, we're missing so much. Folks bring so much that with them to college, and our role should not be to strip that out of them or make them use it only in particular spaces. So I'm really taken with the idea that we really need to talk about class and how it shapes what we do.
It's really powerful, Rosie. I think about even things like how students use office hours, right? Really differentially and what they think they have the right to. And those, I see really strong class differences in, the sense of privilege that some students bring to that affordance. And then of course, that leads me to Sue. And, Sue, you study many of these issues. So what are the barriers left for you to work on? And if you give a good answer, Sue, we'll let you stay here at the University of Michigan instead of leaving us. So you're on the hot seat.
No pressure there. I am returning home to Boston next summer. There you go. To the University of Michigan of the East. I will be hanging out in Cambridge. And I will miss this wonderful community, but I'll be nice to get back with family. So, you know, it's a constant, you know, trying to make policy serve its intended effect is a constant battle, because the natural tendency, you know, I think it's like of the universe is like towards bureaucracy and towards making programs more complicated. So consider something as simple as free college. Well, that's, you know, basically what the Hale Scholarship offers to low-income students in Michigan. They get a commitment that their tuition is going to be covered for 4 years if they and fees as well if they get admitted to University of Michigan. So that information gets pushed out to students during the application season, and that's what has worked to increase applications so much to University of Michigan among these students. There are other ways to make free college happen. So some quote unquote free college programs basically say, well, look, we have for low income students, we've got the Pell Grant and other financial aid programs. So for them, it already is free if they go through the process of applying for aid. And we need to make it free, therefore, for the and no tuition costs for middle income and upper income students. So the barriers are left in place in terms of administratively how people have to go through the process of applying for aid. And free college doesn't actually serve the goals that you're hoping. Another way to do free college is literally say tuition is zero, which then affects everybody equally. And you could then focus, say, need-based financial aid on living expenses for the low-income students. So the devil is in the details when it comes to how a given program will work. And you know, before I have a doctorate in econ, but before that, I did a master's in public policy. And part of my appointment is at the Ford School of Public Policy. And so, an attention to implementation is how it's sort of, you know, dismissed. It's implementation, or it's, you know, transaction costs. But honestly, it's the heart of the policy. It's where the rubber hits the road, and it's how policies actually affect people. My work and that of many other people shows that's really matters for whether a policy intensifies or reduces inequality. The other thing that I worry about is the long-term trend in decreased funding for public institutions, which are the schools that educate a vast majority of undergraduates, especially low-income students. So for decades, taxpayer funding for higher education, post-secondary education has been dropping. That accelerated during the Great Recession, and it had not yet fully recovered when COVID hit. And because these institutions are funded by states, which have to balance their budgets, when you have an enormous recession and taxpayer revenues go down, there's not money for the colleges. And that shows up as a mix of increased tuition prices, because the money's got to come from somewhere, and decreased services. And that combination is part of why we're seeing a 20% drop in community college enrollment this fall, which is a pretty horrifying number. Community colleges are the gateway to post-secondary education for low income, for disadvantaged students. So those are the things that remain to do. There's always going to be something to do.
There will always be something to do. And that was a great answer. So you can see me tomorrow about staying. It sounds like your dog wants you to stay. So we do really appreciate that you'll continue the work wherever you are. And so last but not least, Mike, you've done this great work on landscape. What are the barriers that still exist, and what are you going to do about them?
Gosh, all of them. Yeah, I mean, inside of admissions, I mean, I couldn't in 5 minutes list all of the barriers just inside one little process. Because it's whether, I mean, if you're looking at like legacy admissions, I mean, you know, students are 16 times more likely to be admitted to Harvard if they're legacy than if they're not. I mean, the numbers are massive. You know, if you're talking about extracurricular activities, so unequally proportioned, you know, across high schools in America, you'd be amazed at the number of admissions officers that don't care about if you've had a job or not. You know, like, so if you're a lower income student or a first gen student, one of the main things you do outside of school is work. And yet there are a lot of universities that don't even think that's a thing. Like they don't have any way to interpret that and make decisions on how that would be an added value to a college campus. For example, standardized testing is a whole thing that we could do like an entire a whole separate session on. So just all of these parts of the process, not to mention varsity blues and athletics, which we could also talk about extensively. So get to a better place. I think that, I think part of the reason that I focused on contextualizing people's achievement or contextualizing their lives inside the process is I feel like it's a way to look at a lot of different dimensions of the process and give people a fair shake. To say like, what are the opportunities that people have really had access to? And can we give people better information about those contexts? And can the people who are making decisions be more knowledgeable about the real lives of the people that they're reading? Because one of the big problems in admissions is that you're reading applications, not people. You're not sitting down for the most part and getting to know someone. You're looking at pieces of paper and you're making decisions off of that paper. And a lot of the things that are even outside the paper that you might want to do are really problematic, like interviews, for example, are super problematic. I think that's part of why I'm going in this direction. One of my existing projects, in addition to the landscape project, is to looking at engineering students across Michigan colleges and trying to examine how they have performed in context in their high schools and whether or not that has a relationship to their success in college. So we started off looking at this for University of Michigan students because we have awesome data here at the University of Michigan. And we were able to look at this, but then we also are able to look now at all of the colleges in public colleges in Michigan with engineering programs and be able to say like, hey, if you're a really good student in your high school compared to other students in your high school, are you likely to succeed no matter where you go? And one of the reasons that I'm interested in this is because when I do field work in admissions offices, I cannot tell you how many times I hear people say, we can't admit this person because they're just not going to succeed here. And you hear it again and again and again. And, 18 times, I'm usually not trying to intervene, but of course, as a non-researcher, I want to say, what is your evidence, right? Like, what is the evidence that you have that this person isn't going to succeed here? I think your evidence is that you don't have it, but I think what you're thinking is comparative. You're looking at people compared to other people that you're looking at, and you're saying, this person has slightly weaker credentials than the other people that I look at. And then you make this inference that isn't justified, which is, this person can't succeed because they don't look quite as great in comparison. And the reality is that it's just really hard for people to keep in their heads that a lot of people are really competitive, that low-income students have gained so much in their academic preparation in the last 30 years in terms of their STEM preparation or other kinds of academic preparation. They've gained over a standard deviation in achievement over that time. It's an immense, actually, gain for the American secondary school system, really. But higher income students and white students have gained a little bit more over that same period of time. So if it's all about comparisons, then you're going to just see increasing gaps. But if you're looking at whether you're qualified to do really high level work at places like Michigan or like other kinds of selective institutions, then we actually have a lot of students to choose from that can contribute a lot to our classes. So if anything, I guess I'll say that's my hope for the future, is that there are so many people who could benefit from college education, and we just need to provide places for them.
Wow, there's so many shared themes across your 4 responses to this question of barriers. And a couple of things really jumped out at me, like this notion that we're making some surface level changes that look good, but that don't, as Sue said, get to the heart of the real issues. And so then don't actually redress the inequities. And then this point you made, Mike, about jobs and not valuing that young people are holding down jobs, and that's that tells you a lot about their ability to succeed, their perseverance and all sorts of other things. But is it enough to tell people, hey, you should think about jobs? Or do we, as Rosie said, have to change the culture to really value, all these things that people bring to the table, the assets that our students bring? So it makes me think about, what are we willing to change to ensure that all students can succeed, as opposed to setting the bar, putting the burden on them. Now, this was great. Well, now we're going to really test you, and we're going to move to the audience questions that we have already received, and then we'll make space for open Q&A. So the first one, I'm going to direct it to Awilda, and then and maybe, well, let's try to stick with one person addressing a question, just so we can get to audience questions. So I'm going to start with this one. What influences a person's choice to seek or not seek higher education? How do you know? And the question was written as, is the goal for all to be educated through grade 16? Why or why not? And I was right away going to, should we make that a goal? So there you go, Awilda. What do you think?
So in the interest of time, I think I'll answer this backwards. And just keep it really brief too. I don't think the goal is necessarily for everyone to be educated through grade 16. I think the goal is that everyone should have the chance to, should they choose to. And I mean, my personal goal would be that there wouldn't be any there wouldn't be any disparities by race or class on how that gets answered. In terms of, I think, what influences the person's choice to be on that margin between higher ed or not, I think there's a number. Well, the research will tell you that there's lots of boxes to that model, right? Some of them would be financial, right? Some of them would be around whether they can afford it, whether they think they would succeed. Whether they would, enjoy it, right? By it, I mean college and seeking higher ed. There's a lot of, I think, newer work that's being put out there that really questions even the idea that it's a choice, and how, if you're from certain communities, your choices are so restricted that it really isn't a choice at all. So yeah, I think I'll leave it at that, just in case anyone else wants to answer it.
Well, that was great. Thank you. I'm going to just keep us moving through the questions, and then if we have extra time, then we can come back to some of these. So this one, Sue, I'm directing to you. How can local school districts help ensure all our students are ready for the challenges of higher education, including funding and support when they start? So you've done a lot of work on trying to provide the funding mechanisms here once they get here, but what can our school districts do to help us with that?
The school districts, well, first of all, it's that they have enough resources to do what I'm going to recommend here, right? But working with the local institutions to simplify, I'm going to say it again, simplify the process, so that, the default is that people know about, have information about, are applying to colleges that make sense for them. Now, what's been tested in some contexts is, say, devoting a class for juniors or seniors that is actually about the college and financial aid application process. So that's been shown to be effective, because then, the sort of filling out the FAFSA, filling out the Common App, filling out the essays becomes something that is part of school. So I guess, what districts, educators in general need to do is make sure they're looking through at the process of applying to college, applying for financial aid, enrolling in college through the eyes of the students involved. And recognizing when informal barriers have been created. It's almost like you need a constant auditing system in place for this, and that could take the form of student engagement in the process of designing these programs. So that's a big, vague answer. but there's many ways to simplify and a process, and just getting in there and paying attention to the details of how are students registering for AP classes. I'd say a key thing that districts can do is look at their data, and perhaps do this in conjunction with an academic if they have a hard time getting at the data. So part of the work that I've done over the past decade is making data available in Michigan for us to understand what is going on with all of our students, where they're going to college. So worked with the state of Michigan to match information onto the student level database that has information about where students go to college and if they graduate. That sounds pretty straightforward, but that information didn't exist in a consistent way 10 years ago. And now through the Michigan Education Data Center, which is a project of the School of Education, as well as the Ford School of Public Policy, we can measure, are we making progress on getting different populations of students into and through college? So having the lights on and actually, driving with your headlights on, I guess I should have started with that, is probably one of the most important things we can do. So you need to know whether you're succeeding or failing before you can figure out how to solve your problems. So do some diagnosis first before you start prescribing solutions.
I really like to the point that I think you're implicitly making, that we could think much more systemically about these things. So, what Mary did, the Michigan Education Research Institute, really was to create a system that makes data available in a way that, school districts don't have to go searching for it. And it's kind of surprising that we don't have these systems in place. So this next question I'm going to direct to Mike, and I might make this a question for two people. So the first part of the question is, why should the University of Michigan have a school of education? And Mike, this is an important question to answer carefully. And the second part of it is there a role that a school of education at a predominantly white institution can or should play in the next century? So, 100-year-old school of education, going into its next century.
This feels like the dean's interview kind of question. I'm going to steal from Deborah Ball on this, because I had, it wasn't a question, there's been a lot of debates, from the 70s and 80s, and there's a number of books you can read on this. I feel like she made a point that about schools of education that was really powerful for me, that I've thought about a lot, which is that schools of education do not need to exist if they do not have a connection. So the connection to educational practice is what makes schools of education meaningful. There are a lot of people around the university who study higher education. We have people in economics, we have people in sociology, we have people in probably anthro, I don't know an anthro person right now, but there are people all over the country in all kinds of disciplines who study higher education, and they do really interesting work, and I like reading their work. But there needs to be something distinctive about what happens inside of a school of education. And I think we need to think about the depth of our knowledge about educational practice in the realms in which we talk about. And one of the ways that was powerful for me was for me to say, I'm not going to just do quantitative secondary studies of stratification. I'm going to do work inside of admissions offices, looking at what they do and trying to figure out what that is. And that can be the competitive advantage for a school of education as compared to people from outside the school of education. And so this is completely not my idea, but it's one that has been very powerful for me. I've thought about it a lot. It helped me make meaning of my own purpose inside of a school of education, my own purpose inside of the university, and seeing the different value that different people across the university bring to the study of higher education. So whether they're in a school of ed or not, if they have a dry appointment or a full appointment or whatever, all of those people have something to bring. But I think it's important for a school of ed to have something distinctive to bring to that process. And I think that helps me make meaning of that question.
Great response. You passed. Now I'm going to ask Rosie to comment on, the dimension of it that focuses on we're a predominantly white institution. What how can the School of Education push the needle in a predominantly white institution, and particularly with its expertise in higher education? What would it take to be leaders on this campus or some other campus?
Oh goodness, that's a really good question, right? So ideally, institutions of higher ed still center teaching and learning processes. And I really think that schools of ed, including the faculty in higher ed, can really use our expertise to shape how we think about teaching and learning and how we organize the university in service of more equitable experiences and outcomes for students, faculty, and staff. I'm center students, but I don't want to forget the staff and faculty that, co-create this university experience with them, who I think are often overlooked. With that in mind, how do we use what we know to help faculty, our colleagues, create more inclusive curriculum, use more culturally relevant pedagogies, really think about how would we organize policies, practices to really attend to those who are often on the margins, right? Like I think to myself all the time when I'm working with faculty in STEM, they're like, they don't know where to start because that's just not part of their training sometimes. So like think about how to validate students. They may be thinking about how to validate a study, but they're not thinking about how would they give feedback to a graduate student in a way that is supportive, nurturing, might attend to their cultural background. So these are things that I think we can do. I think to make that happen, right, it takes building relationship. And that takes time and energy that we as faculty, staff, and students have to be willing to put in. And sometimes we need folks to broker those things, right? Like as a newcomer to the institution, me just kind of walking around and saying like, hey, I have this expertise is not particularly helpful, right? But I've been thinking a lot about how do we demonstrate reciprocity to build relationships. So, recently building connections, for example, with Rackham, because I do work on grad ed. So what service am I doing to Rackham to help them do some of their work on creating more inclusive environments? And how does that leverage what I know, not just with the students I work with in the school, but really thinking about what can we do to serve campus more broadly?
That's great. Thank you, Rosie. Now, the next 4 questions, I tried to figure out who would be best to answer these. So if I get it wrong, feel free to jump in because there's some great questions, and I'm sure you'd each have a great perspective. I'm going to start with Awilda, toss it back to her. How can higher education ensure that graduates are responsible citizens who can really, contribute to their local community or to the state and nation? What do you think higher ed's role should be in that?
I think, there's this sort of classic argument between like higher education as sort of like this transformative and liberatory education. And then there's the sort of vocational aspects of higher education. It's sort of like training for work. And I think this is a really interesting question because we typically think about, one of the things I typically pose in class is who gets to do the exploration and, development in higher education, and who has to come in or feel like they have to have some sort of predetermined outcome and some very practical reason for entering higher education. And so I don't think I have a very good, straightforward answer for this, other than to sort of kind of complicate the question even more. I don't know that, I think you can have both. I just think I always try to pose the question back to who gets to do which, who gets to take which route.
Yeah, that's actually a really great point that, I think most people don't think about, right? They just have this argument, this debate, as if it has to be dichotomous. So maybe the answer is how you bring the two together and attend to, equity. Yeah. Let's take on this next question. I'm going to give this to Sue. I'll be curious to see how you're going to answer this. Taxpayer dollars are used to support K-12 online learning, particularly online for-profit institutions. Do you foresee any change in that? And I would add, what do you think might be the implications of that for other settings, like maybe higher ed?
So I have not done research directly on online education, but I've reviewed the evidence on it, and so I have written about the evidence and sort of summarized it for folks in columns for the New York Times and for the Brookings Institution. One of the pieces that I wrote talked about how bad laptops are during class because the evidence indicates that they distract students from actually listening because they're transcribing a lot of the time. And boy, did COVID make all of that really irrelevant. So everything is so it's like my nightmare coming true. So the evidence was that online learning worked well for students who were already doing well. So online learning worked well for, say, offering to opening up opportunities that students otherwise couldn't have. So, maybe you're attending a small rural school and it doesn't have a calculus teacher, so you can't do AP calculus. But if you're able to take that class online, that seems to be a net improvement for the students involved. MOOCs were the next best thing for a while. And the evidence is that who succeeds in MOOCs? People who already have degrees and are kind of continuing their education, right? Who doesn't do well in online classes? There's something called credit recovery, where a high school student flunks their in-person class. And so they get put into an online class to repeat it until they pass it. This is not good. See, they don't like it at all. They don't like it. The evidence is that this is not good. And so this is hence my statement that COVID is making everything worse, because online education intensifies inequality. Now, there are districts, there are schools, there are classrooms that buck this, where people have figured out how to make the classes more engaging. I think online education is going to be with us now for a long time. My fear is that, with the funding cuts, that they may be made permanent for the people who are least able to benefit from it, who are actually harmed by it. So I think it's a mode of learning. We shouldn't be banning it from the funding stream. We need to use it as a tool to advance our goals as educators, recognizing what the barriers are for so many students. And students not having Wi-Fi, for example, in their homes, an entire set of siblings relying on a single cell phone for logging into their classes, right? So one advantage of what's been happening with COVID, I think, is exposing these inequities, so that maybe we are clearer about what we're dealing with going forward when we suggest that given classes be moved online for students.
Yes, so you make so many valuable points, and this your response, I think, will lead into the next question, which I'm going to toss to Rosie. We have two questions. One will be for Rosie, one will be for Mike, and then we're going to be moving into the open questions, and I invite you to put questions in the chat. Krista will be monitoring that for us and helping make sure that we see the questions. So get ready, load up all your really hard questions for our experts. And Rosie, I'm going to ask you, we just heard Sue's response about online learning and partly about how money might be shifted, right, to fund learning opportunities. How do you expect schooling, whether it's K-12 or higher ed, to divert from the typical classroom paradigm in the future? And what I'm going to add to that, what might be some things, because you study higher education learning, right? What might be some things you'd like to see come out of what we've learned as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic?
Such a good and very difficult question. I think underlying is the assumption that schooling happens in lots of places, or learning, right? So schooling being this very organized, formal structure, maybe I'll ask us to turn our attention to learning. And learning can happen in lots of spaces. I was a student affairs educator, still think of myself that way. Learning can happen related to many things outside of a formal classroom. And so I think we can think more expansively about how we want and what we want students to learn with us. And how does that happen? Is it in a lab? It might be online, synchronously or asynchronously. It might be in person. It might be sitting in the grass. I don't really know. But I think there are more expansive ways to think about how to put people in relationship with each other and in relationship with content, right? And I will just be honest in that my own imagination is somewhat limited as somebody who went to very traditional in-person, butt in the seat, look forward classroom spaces until graduate seminar, right? So I think that question is yet to be imagined, but really turning our attention from schooling and really thinking about learning. How do we engage and organize to help people learn with each other?
What a beautiful response. And that distinction between schooling and learning is just so powerful and so important. And also reminds us not to imagine or assume that people, just because they're not in a classroom, are somehow, falling behind. As you know, that's a soapbox I'm on these days. Let's change the deficit narrative. So Mike, you have the last question. You don't have much time. It's a simple question. What are some of the most understudied issues in higher education? Simple, just, rattle them off.
Oh, you don't want to keep going on for 5 more minutes so I can think of an answer? I'm going to say, I'm going to say teaching and learning. There's some interesting things about the development of higher education as a field that led us not to really engage questions of teaching and learning as centrally as, or even centrally, it is so central to most of the building. And yet because of some weirdnesses around higher education, we've kind of come into teaching and learning through student development theories and into learning like this. But there's all of this stuff that, that people know about, like learning sciences and from K-12 classrooms, that could still be leveraged so much inside the higher education sphere. And I think we are only just seeing the beginnings of that through work that Rosie does and Lisa Latuca does and Vilma Mesa. Like, there are definitely people who are doing this in the sphere, but I feel like we're just like at the tip of the iceberg of where all of this really could be in the higher ed space. And I hope that we haven't overly given over this space to others. I hope that we become more central in this space in the future. And part of this, as Sue keeps bringing up, is technology too. I mean, we're now technology is going to rapidly become even more central into this. And I think higher ed has kind of given over technology to other people, to tech people or to, snake oil salesmen. And so we could use more people inside of higher education who think deeply about technology and teaching and learning and higher education as an organization. So I'm going to stick with those.
Well, I love that answer, Mike. We've talked about this before. And I also think it relates back to the points about what are we prepared to do as an institution to ensure that students can be successful. Some of that is about changing the way we teach and the assumptions we bring to, who we think learners are and what we think it means to be prepared or ready to learn. So we have our first audience question. It's right now our only audience question. So I encourage the audience. Oh, we just got another one. See the power of just asking. All right, so here it goes. And I'm going to just let this be open so you can kind of, see who's first to the answer. How can researchers communicate their observations to a wide audience in a way that will allow the audience, whether practitioners, policymakers, et cetera, to accept the new information as true and valid and discard previous misguided opinions? My sense is that generally they read the research and they take it as good to know, fun fact, but not necessarily a new truth that they should act on with haste. Who wants to jump on that one? Oh, and I see Mike Spiegel has his hand up too. So he's third in line. Okay.
I'll jump in and say something. So just about all of my research at this point is done in partnership with education practitioners. So whether that's in college admissions offices, financial aid offices, with state education agencies, with school districts. And I'd say that that is the best way in a partnership, I think, to get that information across. If you come in with a solution and push it onto practitioners, it doesn't tend to go very well. So if you come in and here I am, I know the truth and here's what you should be doing, it doesn't tend to work well. Schools are organizations, and teachers and principals are people with psyches. And I was a union organizer before I was a researcher. So understanding how you move organizations was sort of something I approach my, or thinking about how you move organizations is something I think about in my research all the time. I think the Hale Scholarship has been a great example in that what we did with Michigan was to sit down with them and first look at the data and see where low-income students were going to college, where we were losing them in the process. Were they applying to Michigan? Were they being rejected? Getting a shared sense of what the problem was and what the data said. Then we together reviewed the evidence, the research on what was effective in other settings in changing these inequalities, and then designed together a program to test together at the University of Michigan. So we designed the Hale Scholarship together. So it was a program that Michigan in the end designed itself, as opposed to some academic coming in and saying, do this. I think that's the kind of change that has to happen in schools around the world. And that's what academics can do, rather than sit in rooms and design solutions by themselves. They need to be doing it in conjunction with the people who are actually going to implement them.
Great response, emphasizing the importance of partnerships. Anybody else want to jump on that one before we go to Mike?
Say something. I think also research in and of itself may not move policy unless there's opportunity and policy entrepreneurs. And look at something like Hope Scholarship in Georgia. There's tons of research that says that it has deleterious effects on Black students in particular, but the politics aren't there to address that. So I think also considering like what the politics are, what the opportunities are to actually implement, to carry your research forward and to make changes is important as well.
Right. So research is always contextualized, and the results are always read in context and in light of people's biases and values and politics. Yep, exactly. And anything from the other two panelists, Mike, Rosie?
Oh yeah, I agree with both of what they just said a lot. I'll just say that, when you're, I think as someone who does research, you can't take it too personally when people aren't picking it up. If you do it just so like someone else is going to pick it up and that they're going to it's going to change policy, the vast majority of the time, I think you're going to be pretty disappointed at some point in that process. And so if you make that the overt goal, I think that's maybe not the right thing to do. I think the right thing to do is try to do the best research that you can do and try to be policy relevant, right? Like if the opening is there, you are there to provide information, and you're willing to show up on a dime at the moment that people are ready to hear what you want to say. And until then, and a lot of times you just have to wait it out a little bit. If the politics aren't right, if the people aren't interested, if they're not interested in data or evidence, then it's, the window's just not going to be there for you at that point.
So read the room.
Yeah.
read the audience. All right. Well, I'm going to toss this to Mike, and if you want to speak your question, Mike, just unmute if Krista will let you, and go for it. Mike Spiegel.
All right, there I was able to unmute. Thank you. I just want to say thanks, Elizabeth, and everybody There are a lot of us who are super passionate about this, but don't have your level of expertise. So it's great and fascinating to get behind your minds and learn a little bit about the subject that we all care about. But my question revolves around, this whole conversation is geared towards higher education and really starting with 17 and 18-year-olds, and how do we make it more fair and equitable for them to get into and then succeed at higher education. But my question is, what's the most efficient age to start solving this problem? Is it with 17 and 18-year-olds? Maybe it's, the obvious answer is when they're 2 or 3 or 4, but what's a realistic age to where we should, if we're really going to solve this problem, start to work towards a solution?
Well, Awilda, you're doing a lot of this work with high school students. If you could start earlier, where would you love to start?
Well, in a former life, I worked in a nonprofit that worked with 7th graders, and we were identifying talented 7th graders and, providing them academic supports then. I mean, thanks for the question, Michael. I mean, I think you're right. Like I would say these inequities start almost immediately, right? And so if you were to address these inequities, you'd have to start then. From preschool. But, with regards specifically to like college knowledge, some of the literature points to like middle school as sort of a starting point, where you can sort of begin to make the ideas of college concrete and start the goal setting there.
Great. Thanks, Awilda. Ryan Henyard, I see you have your hand up and a giant bird flying behind you. Please shout out your question, and then we'll go to Adam, my former student, Adam Aaron. Go ahead, Ryan. I think you're muted. Krista, do you have?
Okay, did that go through? Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for this discussion. It's been really great to hear, and it feels good to be connected with folks. I miss seeing you all around campus. My thoughts have been around the evolving relationship of the university and society, and the expectations that the general populace has for what institutions of higher education are called to do. Some of this is towards Awilda's comment earlier about the liberating focus of liberal arts education versus the vocational aspects that we're often pressured under. But my worry is that COVID is going to exacerbate the transactional nature of how people are approaching higher education. I'm curious if anyone has any thoughts on how not just us, but like universities in general can build the political will in order to kind of reclaim our place reclaim our place as educators and as valuable parts of society outside of just job creation and job training, because those seem to be areas that are that we have a lot of weaknesses in compared to what industry can be able to move quickly, what online providers are able to do. So, are there ways to try to figure out how we redefine what our space is?
Anybody want to jump on that? Ryan's always asking us challenging questions.
I don't know if I have a good answer, but I keep thinking back to Sue's earlier point about partnership, right? Like, what does our partnership look like with the communities where we reside? What does it look like to the communities where the students who come and join us come from, right? And some of that lack of relationship or limited relationship, like, this is our space, this is, the bounds of the university is our space, and if you aren't part of it, you can't be in it, I think reinforces that idea of us being separate and apart. That earlier question about citizenship, all I kept thinking is, well, who decides what's a good citizen, and who are we responsible to, right? Like the university being responsible to more than those that are just enrolled. And I really do think there's a possibility for us to reimagine our responsibility to each other. I think if anything comes out of COVID, out of the many things, right? One of them is, how do we rethink our responsibility to each other? Like these simple decisions that sometimes don't seem simple, do I leave or not, have a lot to do with what we owe each other, for those who watch The Good Place. And so I'm really taken with this idea that we can rethink how we want to be in relationship with communities around us.
Thanks, Rosie. I'm going to read a question from Adam. Now I have to find it in the chat because the chat went on without me. Here we go. Adam's question is, what can faculty and non-education departments, especially graduate student instructors and early career faculty, do to help push for some of the systemic changes and policies discussed tonight in their institutions, while also supporting the students most affected by the inequalities in higher education? So not just people in a school of ed. Adam got his degree here in the School of Ed, but now is becoming an historian. So, you know, what does someone in a history department do to navigate these inequalities and inequities?
Oh, I think there's so much that you can do. I mean, you have so much more. You have so much more autonomy over your domain than maybe you might think that you do. I mean, it's actually, what's really hard is for university people to change anything. I mean, if you have a critical mass of people inside of a department that are willing to change how teaching and learning occurs, how admission into the department occurs, how you create cultures that are inclusive and create senses of belonging in that department, you can have, I think, much more impact in some ways than people who are at higher levels of the university that are trying to think desperately about what leverage they have to try to get people in a department to do the things that you might want to, that you can do. So, I think that actually you can be incredibly powerful, and I'm not sure it has to have, I'm not sure it even has to be that many people. Like, I don't think you have to get even a majority of people in the department to do it. Like a small group of people who are committed and are willing to push things forward in order to move that agenda forward, I think it have, incredible impact on the people within your sphere of influence. And those things can then diffuse to other departments. I mean, how often do we see that, a department wants to do something and they start looking to other departments and saying, who's doing this and how are they doing it and how could we do better? So, you can have influence not just over your space, but across a lot of other spaces. And Julie Posselt's work is great for this. She's a grad at the center and is doing work on science, right? Science fields right now. And, you can read her new book and she has discussions about, everybody wants to know what, Michigan Applied Physics is doing, because they're doing this amazing job of creating an inclusive atmosphere, admitting much more diverse groups into their graduate programs. And I think that can be, more powerful than other people who may seemingly have more hard power, but that kind of soft power can be really influential.
I mean, just as an example of this, if I can throw in, the University of Michigan has done a fantastic job in recent years in encouraging doctoral students, encouraging faculty to use the administrative data about its students to learn about what works in teaching and learning. And the professor who really spearheaded this effort to make these data available is a physicist, an astrophysicist, Tim McKay, right? So he got a bee in his bonnet and he pushed the administration to make resources available to let researchers as well as instructors have access to the data that they can use to contextualize what's going on in their students' lives. And to do research on what works better. So one of my students, doctoral students in economics, was able to test out some approaches to reducing gender gaps in STEM in econ classes. And because the data was available, it was very low touch, very cheap to do this, to learn from it. And all of that happened because an astrophysicist decided, why don't we know more about what's happening at our own university in terms of student dropout rates and what classes students are taking, and how can we make that data more available? So it's not something that's limited to schools of education in making this change.
Two great examples, and both Tim's work and Julie's work are great to follow up on. And thank you, Ryan, for popping that link into the chat. So I had missed, for some reason I can't see Jesse's chat in the full chat. So Chris has sent it to me. She has a question. Veronica has a question. We are over time, but I understand if people have to leave. I'm sure our panelists will forgive you if you have to leave. But I will just try to get these last two questions on the table, if that's all right with everyone. And I also just want to give a little shout out to Jan Lawrence, my friend, who is an emerita faculty member from the center who joined us tonight. So hi, Jan. Saw you when I was scanning the Hollywood Squares. So here's, now where did Jesse's question go? I agree with Professor Donarski that going online due to COVID put a spotlight on the inequities of student access. With that finally being acknowledged, what should school prioritize to help level the playing field for students struggling with access? So, and I think, Jesse, do you mean K-12, higher ed, both? Sue, it looks like you were getting ready to respond.
Sure. I mean, basically, so there's pushing for policy to make things more equitable, and then there's school districts and school buildings and principals just getting the job done themselves, and it's been a mix. So I think what we're getting now is a push for municipal Wi-Fi, so that people don't have to sit in McDonald's parking lots in order to access Wi-Fi to take their classes. I mean, in some districts, they sent out buses to neighborhoods with Wi-Fi access points on them so that students could log in near the buses, right? So you've seen an incredible amount of inventiveness on the part of principals. But if you're unlucky enough to have a principal who doesn't have those resources or that inventiveness, that's going to intensify inequality, right? So in the end, I hope what we're able to get from this crazy time is a lot of examples of what could be done at a systemic level. So what successes did we see? We just sort of threw school districts and schools pretty much on their own to make this work. Where did it work, and what can we learn from that about what systems to put in place? So that we don't have math classes happening in McDonald's parking lots in the future. What do we do to make sure everyone has access? In many countries, in many cities, Wi-Fi access is a municipal service. Maybe that's where we need to go, and this shouldn't so much be the job of the schools to make that available, but make it something that's a utility essentially.
Hear, hear. That would have solved a lot of problems, and maybe just not redlining communities too, would be helpful. Veronica, let's turn it over to you to take us out. Shelby does have a question too, so I might read that right at the end, but Veronica.
Yeah, and thank you all so much for hanging out late. It's been such a captivating conversation. Rosie, it's great to have you back in Michigan. Nice to just see your smiling face. Mike, my question's for you. Earlier, you described admissions as where the rubber hits the road, and referenced that standardized test scores is something that we could spend a whole nother session on, but maybe we could spend just a minute or two on it. So this is the first year, of course, that Michigan has gone test flexible for undergraduate admission. And what comes as no surprise is we've had explosive growth in terms of application numbers across all types of populations. Certainly at the School of Art and Design, where I'm at, we have had the highest in-state number applications that we've had in the last 10 years. But in particular, the number of students with marginalized identity numbers are just skyrocketing. This mirrors what I've seen too in previous schools where we've removed standardized test scores as part of admissions. And so I'm wondering, is there justifiable utility in continuing to use standardized test scores? And if there isn't, why do we persist in using them Full disclosure, I do see standardized test scores in the use of admissions as one of the most significant barriers of access to marginalized communities. So I definitely bring bias into that question, but I'm interested to hear your perspective.
Well, thanks. Yeah. And I know Sue has somewhat of a different perspective too, so maybe she might want to join in. COVID-19 is giving people, it's basically like a huge experiment now across a lot of institutions that were not willing to move the needle on standardized tests. And between you and me, and hopefully no one else in this room, this was one of the institutions that was really not willing to move, and COVID has kind of forced the issue. What I'll say is that, also I will say too, that the higher ed program eliminated GRE for masters this year. And so we have seen similar things happen that you saw both at information, which you were at before, and now at stamps. Our master's group has nearly doubled in applications. Now, I can't say, right? I mean, COVID is happening and we have a terrible job market, and there's so much other stuff happening, right? But we're seeing a pretty big growth. So I will say though, that I don't see test optional as a panacea. And I so often feel like I have to be the person who just gives sad news. But I think a lot of people want test optional to just be like, oh, if we just get this, then we're going to have equity in college admissions, And there are so many other components that are not just about testing. And from schools that do test optional at the undergraduate level, a piece of data that no one seems to want to talk about is the fact that they're about 10 to 15 points less likely to admit students who don't submit tests compared to people who do submit tests. It is a really, really large effect. And we don't have good causal evidence on this because none of the schools that do this want to share their data, or so I can just talk to you descriptively about what that effect is, but just descriptively, it's a really big effect. Now, of course, students who don't submit may have weaker credentials in other ways. So, I'm not saying that it's all this effect, but it looks to be pretty substantial. So there's lots of ways in which this isn't a panacea, but I will say, my personal opinion is that one of the groups that has the best case about pushing against tests actually has almost no voice in this, and that is women. Women have lower standardized test scores, and their scores vastly underpredict their college performance. So if you were going to sue colleges for the use of the SAT, I think it's the National Organization of Women that should be suing colleges, because the underprediction is really substantial. And it's hard to understand that, if they're just treating men and women equally, about test scores, it's not really fair. Men underperform their test scores in college. Women overperform their test scores in college. I think there could be a lot of movement. I think there is going to be a lot of movement. I think a lot of people think that, am I talking too long? I think a lot of people think that COVID means it's the end of testing. I don't think that's true. I think it's going to move testing. It may mean the end of the SAT, but exactly where Wilda is looking at AP, that's where things are going to move. And there's a lot, there's just a lot to unpack there about whether or not you think it's better for equity that they're going to move towards the AP exams being more central to admissions as compared to the ACT or SAT. And I guess I'll just leave that at that. Thanks for the question.
It was a great response, Mike, and it is such a complicated and thorny issue. And, I don't envy our enrollment management team, some of whom are here tonight, and everyone who's working in this space, because the answers aren't easy, but that was a great beginning to the response. It looks like Shelby may have left us. Shelby, if you're here, we can still get your question out, but I think she may have had to leave. And so she was just asking about transfer students and, how we think about better supporting transfer students. I think that can be the topic of our next conversation. I hope that you will all join us actually for our actual next conversation, which is on March 24th. So just a little over a month from now at 7 p.m. We have Debbie Kaznavis and Simona Golden joining us, and they're going to be talking about how to build on the assets that children bring to school and really value who kids are as they come into classrooms, and instead of trying to, fix them or put things into their heads. And also they're thinking about context just like Mike is, but they're thinking about what context means for children's learning. And so trying to embrace the whole child and support the whole child in instruction. They have done a lot of work in our ed prep program and in our minor around engaging our students in teaching with homeless children and understanding the assets and the beauty and the value that children bring to the table, and also the many barriers that they're facing as they try to learn in our nation's schools. So I hope that you will come to that conversation. We're going to have many more, and Krissa and I are just like always trying to think about who else we can get into the Zoom space. So we hope that you will be one of those people that we bring back into Zoom for each of these centennial conversations. There is a chance to share stories, memories, and photos. I don't know if I can put this link. Let's see. I'll put it into the chat. We're always looking for your stories. We'd love to brag about our alumni and friends of the school. There you go. And help us think about what else to do to celebrate the milestone and to launch us into the next 100 years. Thanks again for sticking with us over time. Take care, and you know what you have to say when you leave one of these events. All right, go blue. Take care. Have a great evening.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. Okay.
Thank you all. Oh, I should have thanked all of you. You're the stars. Bye, everybody.